This is an introduction to absolute value made by Alyssa Markuson. We define absolute value as the distance a number is from zero on a number line. We've previously talked about what a negative number is versus a positive number, and that negative numbers often represent a situation and not an actual value, because while we can owe someone money or have a negative dollar amount in our bank account, we don't actually have negative dollar bills. The negative comes from the situation of owing somebody money. So in absolute value, we are disregarding the positive and negative and just simply looking at its value from zero. So one way we look at this is if we had a problem, and absolute value is always written with these bars. So this is not 141, but this is, so the bars, if I make them a little bit taller, this is, we would say that, what is the absolute value of 4? That's how we'd read that problem. So to solve this problem, we'd have to think about, well, how far away from 0 is 4? And of course, we would know, oh, well, that's 4 away from 0, so we would write this as the absolute value of 4 is 4. And we write it without those absolute value bars because we don't need them anymore. Now, let's say we wanted to look at the problem that was, what is the absolute value of negative 2? Okay, and this time we'd ask ourselves, well, how far away from 0 is negative 2? Well, it's 2 away from 0. Now, is it in the negatives? Yes, but it's still 2 away from 0. Okay, so reviewing what we talked about here, okay, when we see these bars, okay, we say what is the absolute value of, and then we say what is inside. So the red problem, which now is kind of light blue, but the red problem, we would read that as what is the absolute value of 4? And we'd say that the absolute value of 4 is 4. The green problem, we would originally read it as what is the absolute value of negative 2? And then we can say that the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. One thing we can always say about absolute value is that it is always positive. In a previous lesson, we talked about how if we took our fingers and we put them 5 inches apart, there's no way to put them negative 5 inches apart because distance is always positive. And if absolute value is the distance from 0, it's always going to be positive. So in the next 3 problems, they're very similar. So as we go through these, we want to know what is the absolute value of 6. Well, how far away from 0 is 6? Oh, it's 6 away. Okay. All right, the next problem, what is the absolute value of negative 6? Well, negative 6 is also 6 away from 0. Now, if you thought the first problem, this one up here, the answer should be negative 6, you are thinking opposites. We don't want to think opposites. Absolute value does not mean opposite. Absolute value means distance from 0. So 6 is 6 away from 0. Negative 6 is 6 away from 0. Now, how far away from 0 is 1/6? Well, it's 1/6 away from 0. Now, if I wanted to add in one more problem here, I might add in the problem, what is the absolute value of negative 1/6? That is also 1/6. And notice that we write our answers without the absolute value bars. You almost want to think of them like parentheses because we always solve or simplify what's inside the parentheses and then we don't need the parentheses anymore. It's the same with absolute value. We're going to simplify what is inside those absolute value bars and then we don't need them anymore. I'd like you to pause this video now and try to solve these 4 problems. I'm going to go over them in a moment. Beginning now, we'll start in the top left corner and kind of work our way down in a Z. So what is the absolute value of negative 13? Well, that is 13 away from 0. Going to the right, what is the absolute value of 24? Well, 24 is 24 away from 0. Going to the bottom left, what is the absolute value of negative 8 3/10? Well, Negative 8 3/10 is 8 3/10 away from 0. And the last problem, what is the absolute value of 2/5? Well, it would be 2/5 because that's how far away it is from 0. Notice that all of our answers are positive. Absolute value is always positive, and it's the distance from 0. So one reminder that we definitely always want to go back to is that our negative sign always means opposite. Okay, so when we talk about -3, what we're really saying is the opposite of 3. So instead of 3 to the right, it's 3 to the left, because positive 3 is right and negative 3 is left. Or we could use our up and our down. Okay, so the negative sign always means opposite. So one thing we haven't talked about previously is what if there's more than one negative sign? And so that would often actually be written like this. So you'll see parentheses around your negative numbers, and that's just trying to keep the negative sign with the number. So one way we actually read this particular problem is we could read it as -3, but I can also take one of those negatives and I can change it to the word opposite because they mean the same thing. So instead of reading this second problem, and I'll erase the first one so there's no confusion, instead we can read this second problem, instead of -3, we can read it as the opposite of -3. And you guys tell me, what is the opposite of -3? Well, the opposite of -3 is 3. So now we're going to combine this with the absolute values and talk about what that does to it. So going back to the new topic of the day, absolute value is only the distance of what is inside of the absolute value bars. So if we had the absolute value of -3, we would say that that is the absolute value of -3 is 3. It's 3 away from 0. Okay. Now, though, if I put, so a separate problem, if I put the negative outside of the absolute value bars, oops, I'm going to make this like this. Okay, so you'll notice that we have our absolute value bars, and inside of those absolute value bars is -3, but we also have a negative outside. Okay, so how I would read this problem is I would read this, there's two ways. You could read this as negative. What is the negative absolute value of -3? Or you could read it as what is the opposite of the absolute value of -3. So the way I like to solve these problems, and I like to write things down and visually see it, I know that the absolute value of -3 is 3. So I'm essentially getting rid of my absolute value bars and my -3, and I know that the absolute value of -3 is 3, but then I still have this negative here, so it's going to stay there for my answer. Okay, so just kind of a repeat of what we did. We still found the absolute value of -3. Like we normally do with parentheses, we do those first. Same thing here. You're going to do your absolute value bars first. The absolute value of -3 is 3, but then we still had that negative sign outside, so we leave it on our answer to get an answer of -3. Let's continue practicing this on our next slide. So I have 4 problems here that are kind of utilizing this negative sign on the outside. So I would like you to pause this video now and see if you can solve these problems. I'm going to go over them in a moment. I'm going to start going over the problems now. First problem in the top left is what is the negative absolute value of 4. Alright, so we're going to do our absolute value first. So I know that the absolute value of 4 is just 4. And then I'm going to bring this negative sign down. Nothing can change from here, so I know that my answer is -4. Okay. Going to the top right. This time we have what is the negative absolute value of -3/4. Okay, let's find our absolute value first. I know that the absolute value of -3/4 is 3/4. And then I'm going to bring my negative sign down. Nothing can change from here, so my answer is -3/4. Okay, so far so good. Going to the bottom left, this time we have a negative absolute value of 8. Okay, so let's Let's not worry about those negatives yet. Let's always start with our absolute value. So I know that the absolute value of 8 is 8. And then I'm going to bring down those two negative signs this time. We have two of them instead. So if you would like, you can put parentheses around one negative in the number. You don't have to do that, but it is helpful, I find, for some students. So now we have negative, negative 8, or, because we can always change one of those negatives to say opposite, what is the opposite of negative 8? Hopefully you recognize that as 8, okay? The two negatives kind of like cancel out and we get back to a positive. Last one. What is the negative, negative absolute value of negative 17? That was a lot of negatives. All right, so let's start with our absolute value first. Okay, what is the absolute value of negative 17? Okay, well, it's 17. All right, and then we've got two negatives on the outside, so they come down. Put the parentheses if you want. What is negative, negative 17, or what is the opposite of negative 17? Well, the opposite of negative 17 is positive 17. That's our last example for this topic. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions.